Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. My name is Wayne and I want to thank you for tuning in. In this episode we're going to be working on a vintage Tudor Princess Oysterdate. This is reference 7576. The movement is an Etta model 2555 21 jewel automatic. This reference was manufactured in the late 1960s up into the early 1970s. This is a lady's wristwatch and it was purchased as a gift for someone that's very special to me. She's celebrating a milestone birthday this year, and we're also celebrating our 30-year anniversary, so I thought I would do something special. Now this watch is in working order, it's running, and I'm hopeful this is just a simple service and cleaning. However, you never can tell, and when you open up the watch, you never know what you're going to find. Now, I did give this to my wife on her birthday, and her reaction was awesome. She was very surprised by the gift and thought it was beautiful. She's anxious to start wearing this watch, so I'm on the clock to get this project completed as quickly as I can. Now, before we get started, I wanted to show you a close-up of the dial, because there's something here that really excites my wife, and that's the Tudor Rose that you'll see at the top of the dial here. You see, my wife is a huge fan of a genre that I like to call dresses and castles. And if there's a movie, a TV show, or documentary about the Tudor royal dynasty, or any other royal family for that matter, there's a good chance that she's watched it. So when she found out that there was a watch company named after the royal Tudor family, and they used the family sigil as their logo, she was excited that one of her passions intersected with one of mine, so I was very excited to give this watch to her and see her reaction. So let's get into this, and the first thing I need to do is to remove the bracelet from the case. And to do this, I'm using my spring bar tool to press into some holes that are drilled into the lugs. And the spring bar actually snaps into these holes, so if I just press hard enough, I can push the spring bar and release it from the lug. So once we have one side pressed out, we'll position it outside of the lug, and then we can maneuver the other side out pretty easily. Just like you see right here. So we'll take the bracelet and we'll set that aside. We'll come back later and clean that. But let's take a closer look at the case. Now the case and the bracelet were made by Rolex, which is the parent company of Tudor. But this is Rolex's oyster style case, which is their lingo for a water resistant case. And the oyster style cases have a case back that requires a special adapter in order to open it. And I just so happen to have one of these adapters which is compatible with my case opener, but this is the first time that I've been able to give it a try. So I'm a little excited to give this a try here, and we'll press the adapter down onto the case back and we'll give it a turn. And presto, works like a champ. So thumbs up here on the Rolex adapter on my case opener. Now we'll use the friction ball to continue to unscrew the case back until it comes off, and now we can see the movement. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an automatic movement, which means it has this rotor you see that spins as you wear the watch. And as the rotor spins, it winds the mainspring. It's actually a pretty intuitive invention. Alright, so before we take the movement out of the case, we need to remove the automatic assembly. And the automatic assembly is held in place by two screws. And on this particular movement, these screws have been blued. And this makes it easier for the watchmaker to differentiate these parts during the reassembly process. So I greatly appreciate any time they try to make things easier for the watchmakers. But once these screws are removed, we'll be able to get in here with a screwdriver and push the automatic assembly up and away from the rest of the movement. Now, once I'm confident that the automatic module is loose, we'll come in with the tweezers and we'll pull this off of the movement. And what we'll do is we'll take this module and we'll put it into the parts bin, and then a little later we'll come back and finish the disassembly of the automatic module. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the crown from the movement. To do this, I need to loosen the setting lever a little bit, and this will give me enough slack to remove that piece. And again, we'll put that in the parts bin. Now, I need to get the movement out of the case, and to do this, I need to loosen the case screws. And there are two on this watch, one on each side. And once those are loose and removed, I can set those in the parts bin. And with those removed, there's nothing holding the movement into the case. So I'll use my case cushion here and flip it over. Now we can see the movement outside of the case. She's a beauty. All right, so the movement is out of the case and we can put it in our movement holder, but it's time to remove the hands. And I like to use a small piece of plastic in order to protect the dial. And I'll use this in combination with my levers to gently pull up the hands. And this is a safe way to protect the dial to prevent any damage. And we'll use our wood tip tweezers in order to grab the hands, and we'll put those safely away. Now I use the wood tip tweezers for this process because it's a softer material and it's safer for the dial. It's also safer for the hands. So before we move forward, I want to get a baseline for the performance of the movement. To do this, I'm going to be using my Timegrapher to see whether the movement is gaining or losing time, how much amplitude the balance is spinning with, and what kind of beat error we see with rotations of the balance. Now, this is going to help me understand if our performance has improved once we finish the service of the movement. So what I see so far is this is actually a pretty good starting point. Alright, I need to let the power out of the mainspring, and to do this I'm going to press down against the click mechanism, and this lets the ratchet wheel spin in the opposite direction, which allows me to let the power out using the crown very, very slowly. And then once the balance wheel stops spinning, we have confidence that there's not any power left in the mainspring. So we're going to remove the dial, and in order to do this I need to loosen two small screws on the side of the movement. These are the dial screws. And they're very small, and I'm using one of the smallest screwdrivers in my set. Now, under the microscope, you can see just how small these screws are. And once they're loosened, we can turn the movement on its side and gently press the dial up and away from the movement. And you can catch a glimpse of the dial feet here, and that's what the dial screws press up against and how they secure the dial to the movement. Alright, so once again I'm going to use my wood tip tweezers here so I don't cause any damage to the face of the dial, but I'm going to take the dial, I'm going to place it into this little protective box here with the hands, and this will keep the dial safe as we work on other parts of the movement. So the other part that's delicate that we need to remove is the balance. And it's a best practice to remove this first on this side of the movement because it has a part called the hairspring. And the hairspring is very tiny, it's very fragile, and it's easy to bend or break. If you hit it with your screwdriver or your tweezers, you're in for a pretty rough restoration. And I've done a few hairspring repairs myself, and it's very cumbersome, and it's not my favorite part of this hobby. But because of that, this is something we're going to take off first on this side, and we're going to set the balance aside in a safe place, and we'll put this back on when we wash the movement in a bath. Well, this watch has a date complication which tracks the dates of the month, and we'll go ahead and start removing this. But for those of you not familiar with the term complication, it's a horology term that essentially means any function of a mechanical watch that goes beyond the display of hours, minutes, and seconds. And there are other different types of complications available out there. I have a Seiko watch that tracks the days of the week. I also have seen watches that track the months of the year. There's a complication called a chronograph that will actually track elapsed time. It's like a stopwatch. And one of the complications that I actually find very beautiful is called a moon phase. And this tracks the different phases of the moon, whether it's a crescent moon, a full moon, a half moon. It's actually a very beautiful complication in my opinion. So some really cool options available out there. So I've placed the date wheel with the dial in the hands for protection. And while I take apart the calendar of the motion works, I think this is a good time for one of my shameless plugs. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe button down below. It really helps the channel grow and lets you know whenever I post new content. Honestly, I've had such a great time sharing my watchmaking projects and this whole journey with all of you, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. And if you're into this kind of content, I'd really appreciate your support. Go ahead and subscribe. So there you have it. That is my shameless plug. Now I've flipped the movement back over to the other side, and we'll start the disassembly of the bridges and the gear train. But while I'm working on this side, I want to talk about the Tudor watch company. Tudor was started by Hans Wilsdorf. This is the same man who founded Rolex. And by the time Rolex had become a huge success, Hans had this idea. He wanted to create a watch brand that had the same quality and reliability as Rolex, but at a price that regular people could afford. So in 1926, the name Tudor was officially trademarked by a watch dealer working with Wilsdorf. And the name wasn't random. Wilsdorf chose Tudor as a nod to the Tudor dynasty. This was the royal family that ruled England for over a century. The period of time in which they ruled was known as the Golden Age, because it was full of exploration, craftsmanship, and stability. And these are all qualities that Wilsdorf wanted people to associate with his new watch brand. So the first watches with Tudor written on the dial showed up in the early 1930s. They had this neat little design where the T stretched out over the rest of the letters. On some rare pieces, you'll even see where Rolex is on the dial as well. That's because in the beginning, Rolex basically guaranteed Tudor's quality, everything from the build to the look. It was Wilsdorf's way of saying, hey, this is the real deal, just a little easier on your wallet. Tudor would achieve these new levels of quality and affordability by using Rolex components, such as the case, bracelet, and crown, in combination with more affordable third-party movements on the inside. The watch we're working on here is a perfect example of this. In 1936, the Tudor brand was officially handed over to Wilsdorf. Around that same time, the company started using the rose symbol on its dials. This was again a nod to the Tudor royal family. The rose was the sigil of the Tudor house, and it sat inside of a shield, symbolizing a mix of strength and beauty, tough on the outside and refined on the inside. Now, after World War II, Wilsdorf realized it was time for Tudor to stand on its own and have its own identity. So in 1946, he founded the Montour Tudor SA Company. This was a new company dedicated to making quality watches for both men and women. Of course, Rolex was still there, backing things up, guaranteeing the same high standards for quality, design, and service. In the 1950s, we see Tudor move into making professional tool and military watches. First, in 1952, Tudor launched the Oyster Prince. This was their first watch advertised that combined automatic winding, water resistance, and durable construction. Then in 1954, Tudor introduced the Oyster Prince Submariner, reference 7922. This was a professional-grade dive watch offered alongside Rolex's Submariner. Now, the Tudor Submariner was widely adopted by various military forces, including the French, Canadian, Italian, and Argentine navies, all of which used these watches extensively in the 1960s up until the 1980s. As Tudor moved into the 70s and 80s, they moved away from using the rose as their logo and transitioned to using a new shield logo. The shield symbolized strength and reliability, aligning with the tool watch imagery Tudor was building, while also paying respect to the royal imagery they had used previously. Unfortunately, this was a time period where Tudor began to struggle. You see, the quartz crisis was underway in this time frame, and Tudor's strength, their ability to make affordable mechanical tool watches, suddenly became a vulnerability. You see, quartz watches undercut Tudor's pricing and precision advantages, and unlike their parent company Rolex, Tudor had to compete directly in the same price segment as quartz watches. Now, Tudor survived the quartz crisis, but it lost massive market visibility. You see, during this time period, many of the Tudor models looked nearly identical to the Rolex models, which blurred the distinction between the two. And consumers began to see Tudor as more of a Rolex alternative rather than a brand with its own identity. And by the late 1990s, Tudor had virtually disappeared from the US market. Now, fortunately, Tudor has seen a huge revival in the last 20 years. In the 2000s, Tudor relaunched globally as a heritage-driven, mechanical-only brand, and they have seen huge success with their new Black Bay and Pelagos product lines, which have re-established the brand in the watch industry. Now, as usual, I'm just scratching the surface here on the history of the company. But if this is something that you find interesting like I do, I'm going to include some links down in the description below where you can learn a lot more about this topic. Alright, let's transition back over to the disassembly. And I'm removing the barrel arbor from the mainspring, and the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the mainspring from the barrel. And the best way to approach this is to remove the first couple of inches of mainspring from the center. And then what you can do is very gently let out the mainspring using your fingers and thumbs, just like you see right here. I've found this to be a little trickier with ladies' wristwatches. The barrel is much smaller on the ladies' wristwatches, and it makes it difficult to grip the barrel with your fingers and thumbs and let out the mainspring at a slow tempo like this. But I've gotten some practice with some of the ladies' wristwatches that I've worked on, and I'm getting much better at this. Alright, with the mainspring removed, we can now disassemble the automatic module. And this actually looks more complicated than it actually is. There's a single screw that holds the rotor in place. And with that screw removed, we can remove the rotor from the bridge. Alright, with the rotor removed from the bridge, this gives me access to the reversing wheels. And these are held in place by this half-moon shaped screw. And if I turn this at just the right angle, I can pull the reversing wheels up off of the posts. And we'll clean these up a little later, and we'll lubricate them during the reassembly. The reversing wheels are actually what give the rotor the ability to wind the mainspring when it's spinning in both directions. Really cool invention. Now, on the underside of the bridge, we have two more wheels that transfer the power of the rotor to the ratchet wheel on the movement. And this is the last driving gear, and I can't get this thing to stop moving on me. So we'll pin it down and we'll get this off. All right, there we go. All right, so the watch is completely disassembled now, and we need to give the parts a bath. And I'm using these wire mesh baskets here to organize all the parts into these little bins. And I'll organize them by similarity, so I'll put all the gears in one, the screws in another, and then I'll put the bridges and main plate into these larger wire baskets you see here. And then once I have all the parts separated, I'll put them into my cleaning machine. And the first cycle of this cleaning machine is a solvent. That's that brown solution that you see in the first jar. And I'll run this for about 5 minutes. The solvent, what it does is it removes the oil and dirt off of the parts. And then there are 2 more cycles. It's a clear solution in the jars in the back. We'll run those for about 5 minutes each. But those will rinse all of the solutions off of the parts, and then we'll let them dry for about 10-15 minutes. All right, with the parts washing, we're going to turn our attention to the case and to the bracelet. And I'm removing the bezel off of the case, and that exposes some of the dirt and grime that's gotten up underneath the bezel over the years. And I'll put my microscope in focus so you can get a better look at this dirt. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a piece of pegwood, and I'm going to attack some of these larger chunks of dirt and grime. I found that doing this makes your ultrasonic bath more effective if you can loosen some of these big chunks of dirt and grime. So I'll do this on the case and the bezel, and then what we're going to do is we're going to turn our attention to the bracelet. So this bracelet was also made by Rolex, and it is heavy duty. These links are thick, and they are actually riveted together. But I'm also noticing that this bracelet is really dirty. Wow. I didn't see this when my wife was trying on the watch for the first time. Good thing she didn't see it either. This is a nice little concoction of dead skin cells, sweat, hair, bits and parts of clothing. It's truly unpleasant, and some people have call it arm cheese, but I have another term for it.
Oh, gnarly!
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Spicoli. That's exactly what I call it. And I'm looking on the other side of the bracelet, and it's not getting any better. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my pegwood, and we're going to give this the same treatment as we give the case and the bezel. And we'll go through this and try to remove as much of that nastiness as we can. And then we're going to put these in the ultrasonic bath. And we're going to give this a couple different runs, and we'll get this as clean as surgical steel. So I actually ran the bracelet through the ultrasonic at least 3 times, and I want to show you the bottom of the basin after the 3rd run. So it came out pretty clean at the end, but this is just how much dirt and grime was embedded in those links. All right, so the parts are out of the wash. They are dry, and I've laid them out all nice and neat on my bench here so you can take a look of everything that we need to reassemble now. So let's get started. So the first step in the reassembly is to install the mainspring. Now, I'm going to put a little bit of braking grease on the inside of the barrel. And the reason I'm doing this is the watch is an automatic. And what that means is it continuously winds the mainspring as the owner wears the watch. And there's nothing that prevents the mainspring from winding too much as the owner wears the watch. So the braking grease will actually let the mainspring slide a little bit inside the barrel if it becomes overwound. And that will prevent the mainspring from breaking. Now, I've decided to put a brand new mainspring in rather than reuse the existing. This is just a personal preference of mine. I think when you've got the watch disassembled like this, it makes sense to put a new mainspring in. You never know what the condition of the existing mainspring is, how old it is. Plus, a new mainspring is going to help the performance of a watch. And if you've got it open, the watch all open and disassembled, for me, it just makes sense. So the new mainspring actually comes in this little blue cylinder you see here, and I'm struggling a little bit to get it to move down into the barrel. So I got my screwdriver out, and I'm pressing the mainspring from the cylinder down into the barrel. And oh, well, that's not good. That wasn't supposed to happen. You can see that the bridle, which is the end of the mainspring, is actually sticking out of the barrel. That's not supposed to happen. So what I'm going to have to do here is remove this mainspring from the barrel, and then I'm going to have to put it in my mainspring winder and reinstall it. So I'll probably have to reapply that braking grease as well. But again, we'll have to remove it and then reinstall it with my mainspring winder. And sometimes it's just easier to do it this way. Just like that. All right, with the mainspring back in the barrel, we can go ahead and install the barrel arbor. I normally use a pin vise to do this, but I found that this barrel arbor is too small for my pin vise to grasp. So I'm using my tweezers here. And once this is installed, I'm going to give it a couple of twists. And I want to make sure that the hook on the outer edge of the barrel arbor is going to catch the center of the mainspring. If it doesn't catch, then the watch won't wind. So with the barrel arbor back in place, we can go ahead and install the barrel lid. And I have this little device that you see here that allows me to install the barrel lid. Now, you don't need this. You can use your tweezers. You can also use your fingers to do this, but I found this tool to be the most efficient way to get these back installed. And the reason is it allows me to apply some very even pressure, a downward pressure on the lid in snapping it back into place, just like you see right here. With the mainspring barrel reassembled, we can go ahead and start installing the train of wheels. And this movement actually has a different gear configuration compared to other watches that I've worked on previously. You can see that the second wheel actually installs below the mainspring barrel. The gears do. And those gears interact with another gear on the dial side that is attached to the cannon pinion. And this is much different than other watches where the second wheel is actually in the center of the watch and everything attaches to the pinion on that second gear. It's actually kind of interesting to see how different manufacturers implement a mechanical watch. The principles are the same, but not everything works exactly the same way. So what I'm doing now is I'm installing the barrel bridge, making sure that the barrel bridge is setting flush with the movement, and then the barrel bridge is held in place by 2 screws. So we'll get those installed into their holes, and then we'll get these screwed down. In my last project, I introduced a new process into my restorations, and that's to use this chemical called epilame. Epilame is a chemical surface treatment, and once it dries, it's really effective when it interacts with other oils at keeping those oils exactly where you place them. So I'm applying this to the escape wheel, as we'll be applying another oil a little further down the road, and this will help keep that oil where I place it. We'll let the epilame dry, but I don't want the epilame on the pivots on the escape wheel, so what I do is I press the pivots into this small piece of pithwood here, and that will remove the epilame from the pivots. Now we'll also use the epilame on the entry and exit stones of the pallet fork, and we'll also use the epilame on the cap jewels for the balance wheel. And these are other areas where we're going to apply some oil, and we want to make sure that oil stays exactly where we place it. Alright, so we've got the escape wheel installed and aligned into its jewel on the movement, and now I need to install the third wheel. And the third wheel has a small gear on it which kind of obscures my view of the jewel that it inserts to, so I'll turn the movement a little sideways so I can get a better view. Then once we have that installed, we can install the gear for the center sweep. And this has an elongated pivot which inserts through the center of the movement to the dial side, and the second hand actually attaches to that pivot. And this gear actually allows it to rotate once per minute. Now with all the gears installed, I can bring in my train wheel bridge. And it's important here to get the pivots lined up with the jewels on this bridge. Now this is a much smaller watch and it can be kind of tricky to get these lined up. And this is one of the benefits of having a microscope. I can use the microscope to see these pivots and use these instruments you see here to actually line them up with the jewels. And you can see what I'm doing is I'm applying some gentle downward pressure with this tool on the right. And then I'm looking through my microscope and manipulating the gears to line up the pivots into the jewels. And this is a perfect shot because you can actually see me manipulating these wheels. And then once the silver part of the pivot lines up with the center of the jewel, I can apply that downward pressure and push the jewel into over the pivot. And I have to say, if you're in this hobby and you don't have a microscope, it's really an investment you should consider making. It really is a game changer. And it actually has improved my enjoyment of this hobby. I used to spend a lot of time hunkered over a desk with a small eye loop. I'd actually wake up in the morning with a sore neck. So I really have appreciated the kind of freedom of pain that the microscope has given me. So I'm putting the screws into the train wheel bridge, and you can see that I'm applying some pressure. I continue to apply the pressure with this tool that I have. And the reason I'm doing that is I don't want the pivots to slip out of the jewels. If they do slip out of the jewels and I tighten down these screws all the way, I risk bending or breaking the pivots on the train wheel gears. And I want to avoid that. These little Swiss movements, the parts for them are rather pricey, so it never hurts to take a little precaution. So I flip the movement back over to the dial side, and we're going to install the keyless works. Now I've put the sliding clutch in, And now I'm going to put some oil on the winding pinion. Now, when you're working on a movement that you're not familiar with, you're not quite sure what oils to use. Now, fortunately for these ETA movement, there's a lot of online documentation that you can find for these. There are also a lot of online forums and community groups for people that work on watches, and you can find people that have serviced these movements before and use those as guidance on what oils to use as you're servicing the movement. Now, for whatever reason, I wasn't able to find any documentation from ETA on this particular movement. I'm not sure why. So what I've done, and what is actually recommended, is to find documentation from a movement within the same family. And if that document has oil recommendations, you can take those recommendations and apply them to the movement that you're working on. I found the service guide for a movement in the ETA 2600 family, which is a very similar style movement, and it has very detailed information on what parts to oil and where to oil them and what actual oils to use. So that's what we're using here. So I'm installing the yoke, and the yoke interacts with the sliding clutch. But now I need to install the yoke spring, and this is a part that can fly away on you. But I've gotten this technique down where I'm much more comfortable with it. And what I do is I pin down the curved end of the yoke spring with this tool, and then I pull the straight end of the spring down into place. And this is the safest way I've found to do this. The next thing we need to do is to install the setting lever spring, which actually doesn't look like a spring, but it is. That long bar you see is what interacts with the setting lever, and it's what gives the crown its action when you pull it in and out. If you've ever pulled the crown on a mechanical watch, it snaps when you pull it out and snaps when you push it in. The setting lever spring is what actually provides that action. Now I've added some oil to this setting lever spring, and now we need to give it a test to make sure everything is interacting properly. And this looks really good. This is exactly what we want to see. Now I flip the movement back over, and we're going to go ahead and install the click spring. Now this is another spring that can fly away on you, so I'm going to use the same technique. I'll use this tool to pin down the curved end of the spring, and I'll use my tweezers to pull the flat end of the spring down into place. Believe it or not, that's actually a very satisfactory feeling to get that part in one try. I can remember when I first started this hobby, some very frustrating moments crawling around on all fours looking for tiny little parts like that. So it's a great feeling when those things slide right into place. Now we're installing the ratchet wheel here, and it's held in place by a single screw. So we'll get that tightened down. The next thing we need to do is install the crown wheel, but before I put that on, I want to add a little oil to where it will seat, which is on this part called the rocker. The rocker lets the crown wheel actually slide a little bit, so I'm adding a little oil where the rocker comes into contact with the bridge. Now on this movement, the click actually sits on top of the crown wheel, and is held in place by the click spring and the crown wheel screw. It's actually much different than other movements I've worked on in the past. A very innovative design, but like I said, it's very different than other movements I've worked on. So we'll get the crown wheel locked down, put the crown wheel screw, and now we're going to turn our attention to the pallet fork and the pallet fork bridge. And what I'm doing here is I'm installing the pallet fork pivot into its jewel. And once we have that lined up, we'll go ahead and bring the pallet fork bridge. This also has a jewel, which the upper pivot installs into. And this is another area where it's very helpful to have a microscope because I can see those pivots line up into the jewels. And this is another part where it's very easy to bend or break the pivots. And I'll say it again, the parts for these little Swiss movements are not cheap. So the microscope gives me much more confidence that I'm going to save a little bit of money on parts. So let's go ahead and get the pallet fork bridge locked down with a single screw. And let's put a little bit of wind into the mainspring and make sure that there's some power traveling down the gear train. And the way that we do this is we push the pallet fork and make sure it snaps back and forth. And this is exactly what you want to see here. That means there's a healthy supply of power traveling down the gear train. So we had a little bit of drama after pulling the parts out of the wash. I discovered that some shellac had made its way into the cleaning solution. Still not quite sure how that happened. But what happened is the shellac made its way onto the hairspring, which is like the absolute worst place that shellac can go. The reason why is the hairspring is the most delicate part of the watch, and it will impact the timing of the watch. So I spent some time researching this to figure out the right course of action to take, and I ended up soaking these parts in denatured alcohol, which did a good job of removing the shellac. But I had to take the balance assembly apart in order to clean these properly, and now I'm having to put them back together. And this is a little delicate operation. I've got my staking set out, and I'm putting the hairspring back onto the balance wheel. Now I've got this part on my staking set, and what I'm going to do is bring a stake in and lightly tap the hairspring back on top of the balance wheel. You can't see it from the shop, but there's actually a little mark on the edge of the balance wheel which shows me exactly where to line up the hairspring. I have to say I'm very impressed with the quality of these edit movements and just how well they're designed and how easy they are for watchmakers to work on. With the balance wheel reassembled, I'm going to go ahead and oil the balance jewels. And I treated the capstones with the epilame, and now I'm adding some oil to the top of the capstone. You can actually see the oil pool up. That's the epilame at work there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the capstone into the chaton, which is this bottom part of the jewel encased in this brass setting. So I'll oil both the upper and lower balance jewels, but once that's done, I need to go ahead and put the balance wheel back onto the balance cock. And there's a hole on the balance cock, which is where the stud at the end of the hairspring needs to install. And this is another operation where it's very helpful to use your microscope because you can see these things in much greater detail. Now, once the stud is in the hole, we need to secure it by turning the screw, which presses up against the stud. And it holds that hairspring in place against the balance cock. All right, so the moment of truth. We're going to bring the balance in and see if this watch will run. And we'll have to install this at an angle, and the reason is there's a jewel at the bottom of the balance wheel called the impulse jewel, and it is what interacts with the pallet fork. So it has to be installed at just the right angle so it will interact properly. And that's why I'm rotating the movement to make sure that impulse jewel rotates properly into the pallet fork. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move the balance cock into place, and we're going to see if this balance will start to spin, just like this. And that is actually a great feeling. If you're into this hobby, I mean, this is the best feeling for me, seeing that balance wheel spin up with some good amplitude. And this is especially satisfying after that whole debacle with the shellac on the hairspring. It's really good to see this watch working without having to purchase another hairspring. So we'll go ahead and lock down the balance cock with the single screw. And once we get that tightened down, we're going to go ahead and oil the remaining jewels on the watch. Now I'm using my smallest oiler here to apply a light amount of oil into each jewel. And just enough oil so you can see it go into the hole. Now you don't want to apply too much oil as it can actually negatively impact the performance of the watch. And I'll do this on both sides of the movement. Now I'm also going to apply some special oil to the end of the exit stone on the pallet fork, which was pre-treated with epilame. And then I'll rub that jewel up against the teeth of the escape wheel, which, if you recall, was also treated with epilame. And I'll do this 3 or 4 times in order to get a coating of that oil on each of the teeth on the escape wheel. And this will help the performance of the watch. So we're going to go ahead and flip the movement back over to the dial side. Now we're going to install the motion works and the calendar works. And these will control the position of the hands, also control the operation of the calendar complication, so the date complication. So I need to add a little bit of oil onto the posts before we start installing the gears on the calendar or motion works. And we just want to take our oiler here and apply a light amount of oil around each of the posts, not too much. Now we'll go ahead and install the cannon pinion, which is integrated with a driving wheel. And then we're going to install the minute wheel. Now the minute wheel interacts with that setting gear on the right hand side. Again, those work together with the keyless works to allow me to set the hands with the crown. Now this is the driving gear for the date wheel, and it will rotate the date wheel one position after a 24-hour period. So we'll go ahead and bring in the date wheel now. And this is another part that you want to treat carefully and make sure you don't damage, because it does display on the dial. So we'll use our wood tip tweezers in order to get this lined up properly. Now the date wheel is held in place by two parts. There's a setting wheel guard, and then there's this part here, which has a jewel in it, which holds the setting wheel in place. And this is held down by a single screw. So we'll bring that in, and then we'll get this screwed down. So for the date wheel to advance one position at a time, there needs to be a little tension applied to it. And that's the job of the part you see here. This is the date jumper. And the date jumper is pressed against the date wheel using the spring. So we'll pin that in place, and then we'll cover all of this up with the date guard you see right here. This is the date wheel guard, which is held in place by a single screw. So we'll get that in place, and we'll get it locked down. So I spotted an issue here that I need to address. If you look here, you'll see that the head of the case screw broke off, and the body of the screw is still stuck inside the main plate. I need to remove the body and replace the screw, or the movement won't secure properly inside the case. So I tried a couple different methods, but I didn't have any luck. But I purchased this screw removal tool from Bergeon, and we're going to give it a try. And the way it works is it has these two small pins, which we use to place the broken screw between. And if we take a closer look at the tips of these pins, you can see that they have these claws that have been machined into them. Now these claws secure the ends of the broken screw. So what I'm going to do here is place that broken screw between the two pins. And then I'm going to rotate the movement very slowly, and this will turn that screw right out of its hole. So let's give this a try. I'm taking my finger and I'm going to rotate the movement. And if we look closely, you can see that screw turning right out of its hole. This is really cool. It's always good to purchase a tool that works as advertised. And that's exactly what's happening here. I'm turning the movement, and that screw turns right out of its hole. Look at that. And that, my friends, is money well spent. And as I've said before, and I'll say again, if you like collecting tools, especially tools that are single purpose, single function, and can sometimes be a little pricey, man, watchmaking is the hobby for you. So I put the hour wheel on, and now I need to put the dial back on the movement. And it's held in place by the two dial screws, which press against the dial feet. So we'll get those secured down. And with the dial installed, the next thing I want to do is to clean it. And the way I do this is I take a fresh, clean piece of Rodico, and I will dab this up against the dial and remove any dirt, any hair, any particulates that may be sticking to the dial. And I want to get the dial as clean as possible before we recase this movement. So before I install the hands, I want to adjust the date jumper to the exact point where the date wheel advances to the next day, just like you see right here. And then what I'm going to do is install the hour hand at the 12 o'clock position. What I want is for the date wheel to jump to the next day when the hour hand and minute hands approach midnight. Now with a mechanical watch, this will never be perfect, but you want to get this as close to the midnight position as possible. So we'll go ahead and put the hour hand on, and we'll rotate it a full 24 hours and make sure it jumps over to the next date. And it does. So now we can bring in the minute hand, and we'll repeat this process. We'll get the minute hand on, and we'll set it to exactly to the 12 o'clock position, and then we'll use this hand installation tool to press the minute hand down. Now it's tough to get these things lined up, but once we do, we can just press the minute hand in position. Just like this. And then once we have this in place, we're again going to test this. We'll pull out the crown, and then we're going to rotate it a full 24 hours and make sure that that date wheel advances very close to the midnight position. And that was almost perfect. It advanced about 2 or 3 minutes for midnight, which is about as good as you can get with a mechanical watch. So the next thing we want to do is install the seconds hand. It attaches to the pivot of the sweep second wheel. And once we have that attached, we'll go ahead and press it down with our hand installation tool, just like you see right here. Beautiful. All right, with the movement assembled now, I want to see how it's performing. So we're going to put this on the Timegrapher and see what kind of data we get. Wow, we got a big jump in amplitude. We're now up over 300 degrees, which is great. And we're losing about 4 seconds a day, which is pretty good. And then our beat error is 0.3 milliseconds. I think the beat error went up a smidgen, but anything below 1 millisecond still considered a good reading. So I'm really pleased with the performance on this, and I might tune this a little bit more, see if I can get these lower, but I'm really happy with what I see here. So we'll turn our attention to the case now. And one of the things that I noticed is the crown tube. The original crown tube looked a little worn. I was a little concerned about the crown not catching on the threads, so I decided to put a new crown tube on the case. And what I have here is the new crown tube, and what I'm doing is I'm applying a little bit of Loctite to the threads that will screw into the case. And I'm turning this around to make sure we have Loctite into those threads. I got a little too much Loctite onto those threads, so I cleaned it off with the paper, and now I'm placing it onto this wrench. And I'll use this wrench to screw the case tube into the case. Now what the Loctite does is it builds, when it dries, it builds a very light bond between this part and the case. It prevents it from coming loose. And we use the Loctite also between the crown and the stem. It creates a bond, but it's a bond that can be broken if needed. Now I thought about cleaning up the old crystal and polishing it, but I decided just to buy a new one. Just seemed like the right thing to do. So I purchased a new crystal online, came in the mail today, and now I need to install it. And it's a real simple installation. It just is a friction fit that goes on top of these ridges on the case. But I do need to make sure that the Cyclops, which is the little magnifying window, lines up with the position of the crown. That's where the date will appear on the dial. Now on this case, the bezel is what actually holds the crystal in place. So I need to install that. And I'm going to use my crystal press to do this. And I have this die, you see here, this yellow die, which fits over the crystal. But it lines up with the bezel. So what I do is I put the bezel over the crystal and I'll get it set. And then what I'll do is I'll screw down this die to press that bezel down into position, just like you see right here. And this bezel, when it's pressed all the way down, will secure that crystal onto the case. So that bezel and that case are not going anywhere now. Okay, we are officially on the home stretch here, and it is time to recase the movement. So I've got my tweezers and I'm going to drop the movement into the case, but we need to get everything lined up. So once we put the movement into the case, we'll make a few fine adjustments here to get the crown tube to align exactly where the stem needs to enter the movement. Once we have these lined up, I'm going to test fit the crown and stem to make sure these are lined up properly. Now, while the stem and crown are installed, I'm going to go ahead and lock the movement into position inside the case using the case screws. Now, you may remember earlier that we found out that one of these case screws had broken off. I kind of figured out why. They're not meant to be removed completely during the disassembly. They have this half moon shape on them, and they're just meant to be turned slightly so that you can get the movement out of the case. And that was a mistake on my part. I didn't recognize that. And that can be the tough thing about this hobby, is you have to learn things the hard way sometimes, and often some of your mistakes can be a little costly. So we're going to go ahead and reinstall the automatic module. If you're wondering if you missed the reassembly of the automatic module, you didn't. I decided to reassemble the automatic module off camera. This video was getting kind of long. I try to keep these videos under an hour if I can. So I had to make some sacrifices, and I decided to leave that part out of the video. Alright, so let's finish screwing the automatic module down with its screws, and then we can move on to installing the case back. Now I'm going to put some new gaskets on the case back and in the crown tube. And the gaskets are supposed to help with the water resistance, but before I install them, I'm going to apply some silicone grease to these gaskets. The silicone grease, what it does is it improves the seal between the parts, between the gasket and the parts. So by putting this on these parts, it helps improve the overall water resistance. With the grease applied, we'll go ahead and install the gaskets. And you can see on the case back there's a small lip on the case back which the gasket wraps around. Now unfortunately the silicone grease makes these a little sticky, difficult to work with, but we'll manage. And we'll do the same thing for the case tube. We'll get the gasket pushed into the case tube and we'll push it in with our tweezers, just like that. With the gaskets in place, we can go ahead and install the stem and the crown, but before we do, I want to apply some of this thicker blue grease onto the stem. Now this blue grease is what is recommended for the high friction metal on metal parts. And the stem certainly meets that criteria. So that's why we're using this. Now with the stem installed, we could go ahead and lock it down by screwing in the setting lever screw. And that will hold the stem into position. Alright, we're going to go ahead and install the case back. We've got the case back tool out with the Rolex adapter on. And what I'm going to do here is press that adapter down onto the case back and turn the handles in the opposite direction. And I can use these handles to actually press with a little bit of force. And with that gasket in place, it's going to create a nice water-resistant seal. All right, final step. We are going to reinstall the bracelet. To do this, we need to get the spring bar aligned between the two lugs. And once we have them aligned, we'll bring in our spring bar tool and press the ends of the spring bar in between the lugs, just like you see right here. Once we have this done on one side, we need to repeat the process to the other set of lugs. And again, we'll bring our spring bar tool in and press the spring bar in between the two lugs. All right. Let's take a look. Oh yeah, look at that. Wow, this turned out great. I'm really excited to see this on her wrist. I think it turned out great. I got some fingerprints on the stainless steel here, but I'm going to take my microfiber cloth here, clean a little bit of that up, and I can't wait to see this on her wrist. Oh yeah, here it is on her lovely wrist, and I have to say, I think it looks fantastic. I think she does too. Alright everyone, this was a fun project. I learned a lot and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button down below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you're notified when I post new content. I've got a lot of projects in the works, so we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.